So my joiner knives are getting old, and though Paul Sellers says sharpening blades is part of woodworking, I thought I would go for the once and last a lifetime upgrade and put the spiral cutter head into the joiner. As you can see from the detail view here, it has an array of smaller indexable cutter heads that generally will last you a lifetime with the saw. There's 4 cutting surfaces on each. To get started, I took the fence off. There's a 19 millimeter bolt that holds the lock on. If you get that out, it lifts right off. Pretty heavy, so be careful. After that, the 6 millimeter bolts that hold the fence mounting block come off. There's 4 of those. They're not on all that tight, fairly easy to get rid of, but again, it's a pretty heavy piece of cast iron, so you want to know where it's going and keep your hands on it at all times. Once it's free, you can remove it. It will expose the pulley. The pulley is, if you put your joiner together, you know how the pulley goes together, but you got to take the back off. You don't have to take all of the screws off. You can just loosen the bottom 3, and it will slide up. But I'm always an idiot and forget that every time I take it off to clean it out. I take them all out. So maybe the 10th or 20th time I do this, I'll remember. But either way, you take the back off, and that'll get you to the motor mounting points, and you've got to loosen those motor mounting points so that you can take some tension off of that pulley. The motor is mounted with 4 13 millimeter bolts, and you just have to loosen all 4 of them enough to get the motor to move. And if you listen carefully, you'll hear when I get the 4th one loose, the whole thing sort of drops down, and at that point you've got to manhandle it up a little bit to take some tension off of that pulley. With it loose, you can work the belt around and get it out of your way, and then from there you can remove the very small bearing block mounts. It's a 17 millimeter nut that holds 2 bearing blocks or bearing pillows on the top. And it's pretty hard to get to, but once you get the hang of it, it's not all that difficult. There's a lock washer underneath it. After you get the front and rear bearing pillow block mount out, the cutter head and the 2 pillow block bearing mounts will come out. And note there is a shim on the back, and I shake off here, and most are going to have a shim either on the front or the back. And you remember where it came out of and mark it so it goes right back where it was. First step for disassembly was pulling the pulley off. I've got a cheap old pulley puller here, which I just clamped onto it. Things are on pretty tight. I was surprised and impressed. It took a good bit of force to pull it off, but once it was off, it didn't present too many problems getting back on. Now the pulley is on a pretty long shaft. I wasn't able to get it all the way pulled off. If you look at the back side of the pulley, you'll see it has a bit of an extension, and here I am removing the very small 3 millimeter lock Allen that will let the pulley come off. I'm glad I caught that before I just sort of went Hail Mary and started to pull it out. Once that's out, though, you can go ahead and pull the pulley all the way out. That's all she got. It's close. The puller got it close enough that just a few taps with a non-marring mallet and it came right off. And there's a key as well. You want to make sure you hang on to the key. So they should be identical. Before I separate the bearing pillow blocks, I'm marking them front and back so I can keep track of them and put them back in exactly as they came out. They don't look like they're precision machined, so if the device was tuned for one or the other, I want to make sure I reproduce it. And here's where you have to use a bearing puller. You can get one of these for 50 bucks at Harbor Freight or similar, but there's very little way to get these off otherwise without damaging it. Otherwise, you could just drop the whole cutter head off at a machine shop. It's pretty straightforward use. The back end clamps around the bearing and seats on the shaft, so you're actually pulling against the inner race a couple of turns and it comes off. Just to be safe, I'm marking the bearings front or back as well, even though they're identical. It's just a whole lot easier to know that this one's seated in this pillow block and the other one is seated in the other, and we're going to use it. The back pillow block did not want to pop off, but a couple of taps with a dedicated abuse screwdriver got the job done, and it came right off. Once it was off, it was pretty straightforward to get the pulley attachment on it. It's a little bit difficult because there's not much room to slide in between the cutter head and the mount, but that's where this style of puller excels, because you can actually tighten it down and it will wedge in between the shoulder and the bearing and allow you to pull it off. Once it's set, you pretty much start torquing it down and it will extract the bearing fairly easily. I drilled a 3/4 inch hole in a block of wood that you can see clamped to the bench. That lets me put the bearings back on. I don't have a bearing press, but I've done the socket, deep well socket trick enough in my life to know it works well enough. So I'm slipping the old bearings onto the new cutter head. They're in great shape, no need to replace them, but if yours have any wobble or wear, you can get a new set of bearings when you order the cutter head. Now in this instance, I'm making sure it seats all the way down, because the prior one was seated all the way down, and I wanted to go in almost as near as I can identical. Not quite deep enough socket. Need a different block. The front bearings, piece of cake, small little shaft, and they have a chamfer on them that helps you get the bearings started. So it's not like you're really nervous about coming in at a skewed angle. This one I pretty much got most of the way with just a soft blow or a non-marring mallet. Nothing extreme, and then I used a socket to again make sure it was seated all the way down. The pillow blocks go on the same way they came off. The front is a fairly loose fit. Again, very small differences in machining. The back was a bit of a press fit, and I will tell you, I got a few cuts in my hands doing this, so don't be like me, wrap it in plastic. Nothing major, but it was sort of Mr. Stupid, but I was really excited to get it in. So the pulley goes on, the just absolute reverse of coming off. Put the key in, and it's a very tight fit. Took a while to sort of figure out which way it goes. There was marks from the set screw, so I was able to figure that out. But once you get it all lined up, it's a press fit again with your non-marring mallet. Once the pulley's back on, the 3mm Allen lock set goes back in, and as tight as it's gone on, I don't think it needs it, but I certainly put everything back the way I found it. All right, where the bearing pillow block seat, I'm cleaning out any sawdust or residue or even overspray with some lacquer thinner, getting them good and clean. And then I'm also going to put back the small shim that the factory put in to true the cutter head to run parallel to the table. Off camera, I put the extension bolts back into the pillow blocks. They're threaded at both ends, so I can just set it back down inside the races. And we're almost home. So the first step is when the pillow blocks are back in. Note the Band-Aid now. I've officially cut myself on the darn thing. First step is getting the 19mm bolts put back on both front and back, and getting them tightened down so that the whole thing is compressed. With the assembly mounted, it's pretty simple at this point. Go ahead and put your belt back on. It goes on the top. Then you can lift the motor up and put it around the motor. At that point, you can put some pressure on the motor and retighten the 13mm bolts that hold the motor down. From there, you can vacuum out your joiner if you want, or if you're like me, you can just put the back right back on. 6 screws hold it on, sheet metal screws, goes on the way it came off. Fairly straightforward. You can then put the fence base back on. That's also a belt guard with the 4 6mm Allen head bolts, and they're fairly self-aligning. There's not a lot of play one way or the other. It's bolted up as is, no adjustment needed. Now here's something that's important to note before putting the fence back on, since it's heavy and likely to ding the knives. I've got the bubble wrap covering the knives, and I've raised the table sides, in feet and out feet, up as high as it will go. I've got the locking bolt sticking down, and I'm just easing it up into the slot for the locking bolt. Once it gets in there, I'll start I believe it's a 19mm nut on the tail end of it and work it until it locks in, and then slide the whole thing back. But at this point, the tables are ahead of or above, I should say, the cutter blade, so I'm not damaging the new knives. With the new cutter head, I'm going to basically set a desired start position just to get it in the ballpark. I usually do the finished setup with a real test piece, but what I want to get is the outfeed to be darn near level with the cutter heads, but slightly, just slightly below it. And I gauge that by how much the piece of wood moves when the cutter head rotates, and then I also do that for the rear table as well. Though I check it every time I go to use it, just because temperature changes in the shop. This is a good time to square it up. Hey, Django. Happy dog. Last step is put the guard back on. I don't know how all the guards work, but mine's pretty straightforward. You slightly tighten the screw until you find a line-up position, and then you insert the shaft. So it's time to give it a test. This is a pretty hard piece of hickory. This is a hardness test. More than anything, it's not figured or difficult. But a very hard piece of wood. One pass, it's probably a different feel using it, and it creates a very smooth surface. I did notice that the feed rate was slightly reduced, but I'm not in any hurry, and the difference is just shocking. Wow. So that inspired me to get a really piece of burled white oak out to give it a shot. Grains going in every conceivable direction. This was a cast-off piece from the bookcase project. I really wanted to use this piece, but I just never found a home for it. The spiral cutter head did an amazing job with the complex grain in this piece, and I'll get a close-up of it here in just a bit. The camera can pick that up. So the end result is shockingly smooth, very little, if any, tear out, and a lot of that is my own adjustment and feed. And here is the close-up. Just a wonderful upgrade for the joiner, and I'm really excited to use it. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoy.